Austin, Texas, October 8, 2023. George Schmidt, a 42-year-old respected firefighter, and paramedic Andrew Crowford were found dead in a suburban home under suspicious circumstances. What initially appeared to be a tragic accident soon raised questions, leading investigators to uncover a tangled web of secrets, betrayal, and hidden relationships. George Schmidt and Andrew Crowford met in the most unexpected of places, aboard a luxury cruise ship booked for a firefighter and paramedic conference. Both men, dedicated to their demanding careers, had been looking forward to a break from their daily routines. The event was meant to be a mix of work and relaxation, offering workshops during the day and leisure activities at night. Neither of them could have predicted that this trip would change their lives forever. George was known for his leadership at the station and his easygoing personality. He had been married to Nancy for nearly a decade, and together they had built what seemed to be an ideal life in their quiet suburban neighborhood. Andrew, on the other hand, was younger, in his mid-30s, with a strong reputation as a skilled paramedic who remained calm under pressure. His wife, Susan, adored him, and they were seen as the perfect couple, active in their community and seemingly happy. The two men first crossed paths during one of the ship's scheduled training sessions. It started with casual conversation, shop talk about their respective fields, sharing stories of tough calls and late-night shifts. There was an instant connection, built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of the challenges they faced daily. By the end of the first evening, they found themselves sitting at the bar, laughing over drinks and talking about things beyond work, family, aspirations, and the pressures that came with being responsible for saving lives. Nancy and Susan, watching their husbands strike up a friendship, were delighted. They often worried about how much stress their jobs put on them, and it was comforting to see them bonding with someone who understood that world. The women spent time together as well, enjoying the amenities of the cruise, oblivious to what was beginning to take shape between their husbands. As the days passed, George and Andrew became inseparable. They joined the same fitness classes, explored the ship's endless entertainment options, and even found themselves skipping group activities just to sit and talk on the deck late into the night. Their connection felt effortless, natural, something both men had never experienced before with another person. One night, after an evening of drinks and deep conversation, something shifted. It was a quiet moment, just the two of them sitting under the stars, the gentle hum of the ocean filling the silence. George mentioned how lonely the job could feel sometimes, how the weight of being the one people relied on often left him feeling empty. Andrew agreed, admitting that despite having Susan by his side, there were aspects of himself he had never been able to share with her. There was a pause, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. It started with a lingering look, followed by an almost accidental touch, a brush of a hand, a moment of hesitation, and then the realization that neither of them wanted to pull away. That night, in the privacy of a secluded part of the ship, their friendship crossed a line they hadn't even realized they were approaching. In the days that followed, both men wrestled with guilt and confusion. They told themselves it was a momentary lapse in judgment, something fueled by the freedom and anonymity of the cruise. And yet, they couldn't ignore the connection that had been forged between them. They continued to steal moments alone, under the pretense of their newfound friendship, but it was clear to both of them that something deeper was at play. Returning home should have been the end of it. The cruise was an escape, a brief departure from reality, but George and Andrew found themselves unable to let go. Back in their routines, they sought each other out more and more. Weekly meetups for drinks, long conversations in their cars after shifts, and subtle touches that lingered just a second too long. At first, Nancy and Susan thought nothing of it. They were happy their husbands had developed such a strong bond. "It's good for them," Susan had said once, watching Andrew text George with an amused smile. "They need an outlet outside of work." Nancy had agreed, feeling a sense of relief that George had someone to share his stress with. But what neither wife realized was that their husbands were now leading double lives. George and Andrew continued their relationship in secret, constantly battling the guilt that gnawed at them while simultaneously being unable to stop. Each time they swore it would be the last, they found themselves back in each other's orbit, drawn to a connection they couldn't explain and didn't want to lose. They justified their actions in different ways, George told himself it was just an escape from the monotony of his marriage, a way to feel alive again. Andrew, however, struggled more, questioning everything he thought he knew about himself and his marriage to Susan. Despite their guilt, neither man was ready to walk away. As time passed, their carefully constructed facade began to show cracks. The more time they spent together, the harder it became to hide. Their wives noticed little changes: late nights at the station that didn't make sense, secretive behavior, and an emotional distance that hadn't been there before. But at this point, neither woman had any reason to suspect the truth. For George and Andrew, what had started as a chance meeting on a cruise ship had become something far more complicated than they had ever anticipated. And while they thought they were in control of their secret, they had no idea how close they were to everything unraveling. At first, the changes were small, so small that Susan barely noticed them. Andrew had always been devoted to his job, often coming home exhausted after long shifts. But lately, something felt different. He was distracted, his attention often drifting elsewhere even when they were sitting together at the dinner table. He smiled less, laughed at things she didn't understand, and seemed distant in a way that unsettled her. It started with the phone calls. They were always brief, and Andrew would step out of the room when they came in, muttering something about work. Susan didn't think much of it at first. After all, emergencies were part of his job. But the late-night calls became more frequent, and Andrew's explanations grew vaguer. Whenever she asked, he would offer quick reassurances. Just George checking in, you know how stressful things get at the station. Before changing the subject, Susan tried not to overthink it, but the more she watched him, the more uneasy she became. He was constantly texting, his phone always face down on the counter when he wasn't using it. And then there were the inside jokes. The little chuckles at messages he wouldn't share, the way his mood would brighten after a call with George. Susan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it than just friendship. One evening, over coffee, she casually mentioned it to Nancy. Do you ever feel like George and Andrew have gotten too close? Susan laughed as if she was joking, but Nancy's face remained relaxed. Nancy waved it off with a smile. They're best friends. It's good for them, she said confidently. Honestly, I think it's great they have each other. Their jobs are tough, and we should be glad they have someone to lean on. Susan nodded, forcing a smile, but deep down, her instincts told her otherwise. Something was off, and she was the only one who seemed to notice. Meanwhile, George and Andrew were finding it increasingly difficult to maintain their double lives. At first, it was easy: quick meetings after work, catching up over coffee, moments stolen between shifts. But as their feelings deepened, so did the complications. They started making excuses to spend more time together: extra work trips, unexpected late nights at the station, and weekend outings under the guise of stress relief. It was risky, but they couldn't stay away from each other. What had started as an accidental affair was now an addiction they couldn't break. George felt the pressure mounting every day. He loved Nancy, he really did. But with Andrew, it was different. There was no routine, no expectations, just freedom, excitement, and something he couldn't quite put into words. But guilt gnawed at him constantly. The more time he spent with Andrew, the more he could feel Nancy's loving gaze on him, trusting him implicitly. Andrew, on the other hand, was struggling with his own demons. The secrecy, the deception, it was wearing him down. Susan had started asking questions, and he hated lying to her. He convinced himself that as long as she didn't know the truth, no harm was being done. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before the weight of their actions crushed them both. Despite Susan's growing concerns, Nancy remained blissfully unaware. She had always trusted George completely, never once questioning his loyalty. When he mentioned last-minute plans with Andrew, she barely blinked. "Have fun," she'd say, assuming they were simply blowing off steam after difficult shifts. To her, their bond was something to be cherished, not questioned. Nancy admired the way George and Andrew supported each other. She often told Susan how lucky they were to have such devoted husbands, men who understood the demands of their work and the importance of friendship. She didn't see the late nights as a red flag. She saw them as a sign of dedication to their careers and their well-being. But the signs were there, lurking beneath the surface. Small, unnoticed details that hinted at something deeper. George's lingering glances at Andrew during social events, the way Andrew's hand would linger a second too long on George's shoulder, the nervous way they avoided each other in front of their wives. It wasn't long before Susan started piecing together the puzzle in her mind. The realization came slowly, creeping in through a series of tiny moments. Andrew canceling date nights at the last minute, his sudden obsession with keeping fit, his growing emotional distance. And yet, she still couldn't bring herself to believe the worst. One night, after Andrew returned home later than usual, Susan confronted him casually. "You and George are spending a lot of time together lately," she said, her tone light but probing. Andrew shrugged. "Yeah, he's been dealing with some stuff at work. I'm just trying to be there for him." Susan nodded, but she wasn't convinced. She could feel something slipping through her fingers, something she couldn't quite grasp but was undeniably real. As the weeks passed, George and Andrew grew bolder, their need to see each other outweighing their fear of getting caught. They found excuses to meet during odd hours, stealing moments away from their normal lives, wrapped up in the illusion that no one would ever suspect them. But Susan was watching, and soon, Nancy would start noticing too. For now, the fragile illusion of their perfect lives remained intact. But beneath the surface, the cracks were growing, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. At first, Susan tried to ignore it. Andrew had always been busy with work, constantly on call, and often preoccupied with emergencies. But lately, things felt different. He wasn't just distracted, he was distant. Conversations that used to flow naturally between them were now punctuated by absent-minded nods and one-word answers. He spent more time on his phone, always keeping it within arm's reach, and frequently stepped outside to take calls, claiming they were work-related. When Susan asked who it was, the answer was always the same: just George. She told herself it was normal. After all, they were best friends. But the longer it went on, the harder it was to ignore. The phone calls became more frequent, sometimes late at night, and the excuses grew thinner. Whenever she pressed for details, Andrew would sigh and dismiss her concerns, offering vague explanations that never quite added up. "It's just work stuff," he'd say, avoiding her eyes, before quickly changing the subject. Meanwhile, across town, Nancy was beginning to notice changes in George too. He had always been confident, but never particularly concerned with his appearance. Now, suddenly, he was hitting the gym regularly, paying more attention to what he wore, and even buying new cologne, a scent she didn't recognize. At first, she thought it was a phase, a way of coping with the stress of work. But something felt off. George was more withdrawn at home, less affectionate, and often seemed lost in thought. The easy laughter and warmth that once filled their marriage had been replaced with an uncomfortable distance. When Nancy tried to bring it up, he would brush her off, saying he was just tired. What Nancy didn't know was that George and Andrew had started taking more risks. What had once been cautious, fleeting moments stolen between shifts had turned into bold excuses to spend more time together. They volunteered for extra shifts that conveniently coincided, scheduled spontaneous work trips, and found every reason to be in each other's presence. They convinced themselves it wasn't obvious, but their growing attachment was becoming harder to hide. Susan was the first to truly pick up on the subtle signs. She overheard Andrew on one of his late-night calls, his voice hushed and urgent. He spoke in a way that was far too intimate for a conversation between friends, his tone soft in a way she hadn't heard in a long time. And it wasn't just the calls. Andrew started bringing George into their conversations at home far too often, referencing him in ways that seemed off. "He and George are so close these days," Susan mentioned to Nancy during a casual coffee meetup. "They talk all the time." Nancy laughed, stirring her drink absent-mindedly. "That's just how they are. It's good for them to have someone they can rely on." Susan smiled, but deep down, unease gnawed at her. Nancy didn't see it, or maybe she didn't want to. To Nancy, George and Andrew's friendship was nothing more than a healthy coping mechanism for the stresses of their jobs. She had always trusted George implicitly and refused to believe that anything could be amiss. Even as she noticed his increasing detachment, the missed date nights, and his sudden obsession with new clothes and working out, She chalked it up to midlife restlessness. But as the days went by, the distance between them became undeniable. Nancy found herself feeling isolated, like an outsider in her own marriage. George no longer confided in her the way he used to. Conversations were surface level at best. When she tried to plan something for just the two of them, there was always a reason it wouldn't work. Work commitments, exhaustion, or another impromptu outing with Andrew. The signs were subtle but consistent. George would spend longer getting ready before heading out, his wardrobe shifting from casual and practical to something more carefully put together. He had started watching what he ate, something he never cared about before. Even his music taste seemed to shift. Nancy caught him listening to songs she didn't recognize, ones that didn't align with the playlists they used to enjoy together. Then there were the social events. Group gatherings that used to be a source of joy for all four of them became increasingly awkward. Susan noticed how George and Andrew gravitated toward each other, sharing quiet conversations away from the others. There was a closeness there that wasn't just friendship. Lingering glances, inside jokes that made no sense to anyone else, and the way their body language mirrored each other's without even realizing it. Susan watched as Andrew laughed at something George whispered in his ear, his face lighting up in a way that felt far too personal. She noticed how their eyes would meet across the room, holding contact for just a beat too long. And in those moments, a sinking feeling settled in her gut. Still, she said nothing. Not yet. Nancy, on the other hand, continued to convince herself that everything was fine. She saw the same interactions Susan did, but she interpreted them differently. George was just close with Andrew because of their shared experiences, their stressful jobs, and the unique bond first responders developed. She didn't want to believe that the man she had loved for so long could be hiding something from her. But doubt had a way of creeping in, slowly, piece by piece. And as Susan's unease grew, Nancy started feeling something she hadn't felt in years, alone. The more Nancy thought about it, the more she realized how much of George's time was no longer hers. The late nights at work, the weekend training sessions, and the constant presence of Andrew in their lives. She pushed the thoughts aside, unwilling to entertain the idea that something deeper could be happening. For now, George and Andrew continued to live in the illusion that their secret was safe. They met in hidden corners, took extended lunch breaks together, and exchanged subtle touches when they thought no one was looking. They believed they were in control, unaware of the slow unraveling happening right under their noses. Susan had begun watching Andrew more closely, and Nancy, though still in denial, couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was slipping away. The perfect friendship that once seemed harmless was now beginning to feel like something else entirely, something that couldn't stay hidden forever. Susan had always trusted Andrew. Even with all the late nights, the sudden excuses, and the hushed phone calls, she wanted to believe he was just going through a rough patch at work. But that trust started to crumble one evening when she caught him in a lie. Andrew had told her he was covering an extra shift at the station, but when Susan happened to drive past the firehouse on her way home from the store, his car was nowhere to be seen. She didn't say anything at first, choosing to sit with it, convincing herself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Later that night, as they sat on opposite ends of the couch, she casually asked, "How was your shift today?" Andrew barely looked up from his phone. "Busy. Non-stop calls," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. Susan forced a smile, but her stomach churned. She didn't press, didn't accuse. She simply nodded. But in that moment, something shifted inside her. That nagging feeling, the one she had tried so hard to ignore, was no longer just suspicion. It was real. Across town, Nancy was starting to notice things too. For months, she had ignored Susan's concerns, brushing them off as paranoia. But things had changed. George wasn't just distant anymore. He was different. He had started dressing better, taking more care in his appearance. She had found receipts crumpled in his pockets from expensive restaurants she had never been to and gas stations miles away from home. And then there were the nights he came home late, smelling faintly of cologne she didn't recognize. One afternoon, while tidying up the bedroom, Nancy stumbled upon a folded hotel receipt tucked into the back of George's dresser drawer. Her heart pounded as she unfolded it. A single night stay at a boutique hotel downtown. On a night he had sworn he was at the station for training. Nancy stared at it for a long time before setting it aside. Her first instinct was to rationalize. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe she didn't want to know the truth. Later that week, over coffee with Susan, Nancy brought it up in a way that felt more like a joke than a confession. "You know," Nancy said, stirring her drink lazily, "we should follow them one night, just to see where they go." She laughed lightly, but her eyes searched Susan's face for a reaction. Susan stiffened and forced a chuckle. "Oh God, Nancy. No, I don't think I could handle what we'd find." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the anxiety she'd been trying to suppress. Nancy waved it off with a smile, but inside, she felt something heavy settle in her chest. If Susan, the one who had always been suspicious, didn't want to know the truth, what did that mean for both of them? Meanwhile, George and Andrew were feeling the weight of their choices more than ever. What had once felt like a thrilling escape had turned into something much more complicated. Every stolen moment now carried the heavy burden of guilt, and they both knew they were playing a dangerous game. "We have to stop," Andrew said one night as they sat parked in an empty lot, their usual meeting spot after work. He couldn't even look at George. "Susan's been asking questions. It's only a matter of time before she figures it out." George sighed, leaning back against the seat. "I know," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I don't know how to stop." Andrew ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on him. "What are we doing, man?" he whispered. George didn't have an answer. All he knew was that being with Andrew felt easier than facing the problems at home. Back at home, Nancy watched George closely. She saw the way he avoided eye contact, how he flinched when she casually mentioned Susan's suspicions. He was hiding something. She was sure of it now. But every time she thought about confronting him, she hesitated. Late one evening, Nancy stood by the window, watching as George left the house again, claiming he had an urgent call at the station. She didn't believe him, not anymore. She considered following him, but the fear of what she might discover held her back. Susan, too, struggled with her growing doubts. She wanted to believe Andrew, to take his explanations at face value, but the signs were everywhere. She started noticing how he would take his calls outside, how he avoided physical intimacy, and how the light in his eyes seemed dimmer when he looked at her. She confronted him one night, forcing herself to ask the question she had been dreading. "Andrew, are you hiding something from me?" Andrew looked at her, a flicker of something, fear, guilt, or both, crossing his face before he quickly shook his head. "No, Em. It's just work. I'm stressed, that's all. I promise." Susan nodded slowly, but deep down, she didn't believe him. The tension in both marriages grew thick, suffocating. Nancy and Susan could feel it in the air, in the quiet moments when their husbands were around but emotionally distant. And yet, neither woman was ready to take the next step and uncover the truth that was right in front of them. Instead, they continued to wait, hoping things would go back to normal, all the while sensing that something was very, very wrong. George and Andrew, on the other hand, continued their delicate balancing act, aware that they were running out of time. They both feared exposure, but couldn't bring themselves to end things. The thrill, the secrecy, and the connection they shared were too intoxicating to walk away from. Nancy had told herself time and time again that she was overthinking things, that George was just tired, that his long hours at work were taking a toll, that Susan's concerns were feeding into her own insecurities. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. And on a cold Friday night, when George left the house under yet another flimsy excuse, she finally decided to find out the truth for herself. Acting on impulse, Nancy grabbed her keys and followed him. She told herself it was ridiculous, that she was being paranoid, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this time, she would get answers. George's truck weaved through the familiar streets of their suburban neighborhood before taking a turn Nancy didn't expect, heading toward the outskirts of town. Her grip tightened on the wheel as she trailed him at a safe distance, watching as he pulled into a dark, secluded parking lot near an empty park. Nancy parked a few spaces away, her heart pounding in her chest. She could barely breathe as she watched George step out of the truck, looking around cautiously before another vehicle pulled in beside him. "Andrew." For a fleeting moment, Nancy felt relief. Maybe they really were just close friends. Maybe this was nothing more than work stress relief, like George had always said. But then she saw it. The way George's tense shoulders relaxed when Andrew walked up to him. The way they stood just a little too close. Then, in the dim glow of the streetlights, she saw something that shattered her world. George reached out, his hand resting on Andrew's arm, and Andrew didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned in. Nancy's stomach dropped, and a cold wave of shock washed over her. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. For several moments, she just sat there, frozen in place, watching the reality of her worst fears unfold right in front of her. Her husband, the man she had built a life with, trusted implicitly, was not the man she thought he was. Tears blurred her vision as she fumbled to start the car and drove away, heart pounding in her chest, barely able to keep the wheel steady. She didn't know where she was going, didn't even think. Her hands seemed to move on their own until she found herself outside Susan's house. Susan opened the door to find Nancy standing there, pale and shaking, her eyes wide with shock. Without a word, Nancy pushed past her into the living room and collapsed onto the couch. Susan shut the door, concern growing as she sat beside her friend. "Nancy, what happened?" Susan asked, her voice calm but laced with worry. For a long moment, Nancy didn't answer. She just stared at the floor, her hands trembling in her lap. Finally, in a hoarse whisper, she said, "I saw them." Susan frowned. "Saw who?" Nancy's eyes filled with fresh tears as she looked up. "George and Andrew." Her voice cracked. "Together." Susan blinked in confusion, shaking her head. "What do you mean, together?" Nancy swallowed hard, pressing a hand to her chest as if trying to steady her breathing. "I followed him, tonight. I saw them. They were kissing." Susan sat back, stunned into silence. Of all the things she had imagined, this wasn't one of them. She had suspected something was off, yes, but this was beyond anything she had prepared herself for. Taking a deep breath, Susan forced herself to stay calm. "Nancy, listen to me. We need to handle this rationally. You can't just react. We need to talk to them." Nancy let out a bitter laugh, wiping her tear-streaked face. "Talk to them? Susan, they've been lying to us for God knows how long. What is there to talk about?" Susan reached out, gripping Nancy's hand. "I know you're hurting. I am too. But we can't make any rash decisions right now. We need to figure out what we're going to do." But Nancy wasn't listening. Humiliation and betrayal swirled inside her, a toxic mix of anger and heartbreak. She had been made a fool of, living a lie while her husband carried on with another man right under her nose. The thought made her blood boil. Over the next few days, Nancy's emotions spiraled out of control. She replayed the moment she saw them together over and over again in her mind, each time fueling her rage. She felt sick whenever George walked into the room, completely unaware that she knew his secret. Every casual smile, every innocent gesture felt like a slap in the face. Susan, though equally devastated, was trying to remain composed. She still held on to the hope that they could find some kind of resolution, if not for their marriages, then at least for their dignity. "Let's sit down and confront them together," she pleaded with Nancy one afternoon. "We deserve answers." But Nancy's mind was already elsewhere. The humiliation was too much, and she wasn't sure she could sit across from George without breaking down. She began imagining different ways to make him pay, to make both of them pay. She started going through George's things, looking for anything that might give her more insight into their secret world. She felt like a woman possessed, driven by a need for control over a situation that had shattered her reality. The thought of revenge became a constant whisper in the back of her mind, growing louder with each passing day. Susan, sensing Nancy's growing instability, grew worried. "Nancy, don't do anything crazy," she said one night over the phone. "I'm not," Nancy replied, her voice eerily calm. "I just want him to understand what he's done to me." But Susan wasn't convinced. And deep down, Nancy wasn't sure she could stop herself either. George and Andrew, oblivious to the storm brewing around them, continued on with their secret meetings, unaware that they had already been exposed. Nancy sat across from George at the dinner table, her fork idly pushing food around her plate. She hadn't eaten much in days, her appetite all but gone since the night she saw him with Andrew. She could feel him watching her, sensing her distance, but she didn't care. The house felt colder, emptier, and yet she felt suffocated every time George walked into the room. "You okay?" George asked cautiously, breaking the uneasy silence. Nancy glanced up briefly, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "Just tired," she murmured before quickly looking away. George studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing. He had been noticing the change in her, how she barely spoke to him anymore, how she avoided his touch, how her usual warmth had been replaced by something colder, harder. He wanted to ask more, to push for an explanation, but a part of him didn't want to know the answer. Across town, Susan was in a similar state of turmoil. She had barely slept since Nancy's late-night visit, her mind racing with questions she didn't want to face. Should she confront Andrew? Should she pretend everything was fine and hope it all went away? She hated the uncertainty, the anxiety that gnawed at her every waking moment. Andrew, on the other hand, was blissfully unaware of his wife's internal struggle. He carried on as if nothing had changed, still sneaking out for work obligations, still coming home late with the same tired excuses. Susan watched him closely now, her eyes following his every move. She noticed the way his hands trembled slightly when he checked his phone, how he was always in a hurry to leave, how he seemed distracted even when he was home. But she wasn't the only one watching. Nancy had become obsessed. She found herself fixating on the tiniest details: George's cologne, his phone habits, the way he lingered in the bathroom for too long. Every little action felt like confirmation of his betrayal. At night, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, playing through the scene she had witnessed over and over again in her head. The image of them together haunted her, fueling the storm brewing inside her. George, sensing the shift, tried to bridge the growing gap between them. He asked if she wanted to go out for dinner, suggesting they take a trip like they used to. Nancy simply nodded but never followed through. She was always too tired or too busy, and George couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One afternoon, Nancy sat in their bedroom, sifting through George's belongings while he was at work. She wasn't even sure what she was looking for anymore. Proof? An explanation? Some sign that it had all been a misunderstanding? Her fingers trembled as she found an old watch tucked away in his drawer. She remembered giving it to him on their anniversary, and now it felt like a relic of a marriage that no longer existed. George and Andrew, caught up in the illusion of their secret world, barely noticed the tension tightening around them. They had grown too comfortable, too confident in their ability to keep their affair hidden. Their stolen moments were filled with whispered reassurances that they were in control, that no one suspected a thing. But deep down, Andrew was beginning to feel the strain. Susan's eyes lingered on him longer than they used to, her questions becoming sharper. She had stopped asking him to help around the house, and he could sense the quiet disappointment in the way she looked at him. And Nancy was unraveling. She began asking strange, pointed questions, little jabs that made George's stomach churn. "Do you ever feel like you're living a double life?" she asked one night, her voice deceptively casual as she washed dishes. George froze for a moment before forcing a chuckle. "What? No. Why would you ask that?" Nancy shrugged. "Just wondering." She studied his reaction closely, waiting for a sign of guilt, for a crack in his usual calm facade. But George, ever the master of deflection, carried on as if nothing was wrong. Still, the questions continued, subtle but unnerving. The tension escalated at a small dinner party hosted by mutual friends. Nancy and Susan both watched their husbands like hawks, observing their interactions in a way they never had before. The way George leaned just a little too close to Andrew when he spoke. The way Andrew laughed a little too easily at George's jokes. Things that once seemed harmless now felt loaded with meaning. Nancy barely spoke that evening, while Susan made nervous conversation, all the while her mind racing with thoughts of confrontation. Later that night, as George got ready for bed, he caught Nancy standing in the doorway, watching him. Her expression was unreadable, and for a fleeting second, he felt a chill crawl down his spine. "You've been acting strange lately," he said carefully, slipping under the covers. Nancy tilted her head slightly. Have I? George forced a smile. Yeah. Something on your mind? She hesitated for a moment, then simply said, no. But there was something in her eyes, something that made George uneasy. He lay awake long after Nancy had turned off the lights, wondering if she knew. Meanwhile, Susan sat alone in the living room, clutching a glass of wine and staring at her phone. The weight of what she knew was crushing her, but the fear of confronting it kept her frozen in place. She wanted answers, but more than that, she wanted to turn back time to when everything felt normal. The night air was thick and heavy, pressing down on Nancy like a weight she couldn't shake. She sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. George had left the house hours ago, muttering something about another late shift. She didn't believe him. She hadn't believed him in weeks. Tonight, she wasn't going to sit at home, drowning in her suspicions. Tonight, she needed the truth. No more doubts, no more whispers in the back of her mind. Following George's truck, Nancy kept a safe distance, her heart pounding as he drove through familiar streets before turning onto a quieter road. Her stomach twisted when she realized where he was headed. Andrew's house. Nancy parked a few houses down, her hands trembling as she stepped out of the car. The street was eerily quiet, and for a moment, she stood frozen in place, staring at the house that now held the truth she had been so desperate to avoid. Taking a deep breath, she crept toward the side of the house, staying in the shadows. Through the living room window, she saw them. George and Andrew, standing close, too close. Andrew said something, and George laughed, a sound Nancy hadn't heard from him in months. The way they looked at each other, the easy familiarity, the comfort, it was all there, undeniable. And then, without hesitation, George reached for Andrew, their hands lingering before he leaned in and kissed him. Nancy's vision blurred with tears, and a choked sob escaped her lips before she could stop it. Her heart shattered into a million pieces as the reality she had been trying to deny finally consumed her. Something inside her snapped. Without thinking, Nancy stormed to the front door and pounded on it furiously. The sound echoed through the quiet night, sending shivers down her spine. Inside, George and Andrew froze, their heads snapping toward the door. When Andrew cautiously opened it, Nancy pushed past him, stepping into the living room, her eyes wild and filled with rage. George paled. Nancy, what are you doing here? Nancy's breath came in short, ragged gasps. What am I doing here? Her voice cracked, the weight of betrayal pressing on her chest. You lied to me, George. All this time. I knew something was wrong. But this? She gestured between them, tears brimming in her eyes. This? Andrew swallowed hard, stepping back instinctively as Nancy's voice grew louder. Nancy, listen. No, she snapped, cutting him off. You don't get to explain this away. I gave you everything, George. I trusted you. George took a cautious step forward, his hands raised. Nancy, please, just... Don't you dare, she hissed, trembling with anger. How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me? Andrew looked away, guilt written all over his face. George struggled to find the right words, but nothing came. Her hands clenched at her sides, her mind spinning with an avalanche of emotions. Betrayal, humiliation, heartbreak. She scanned the room, her gaze landing on something within reach, something that in that moment felt like the only way to regain control. Her breath caught, chest tightening under the weight of it all. Before she could think, she grabbed it. The heaviness in her grip was unfamiliar, yet it felt inevitable, fueled by the turmoil raging inside her. The air in the room thickened, a suffocating silence settling as George and Andrew stood frozen, their wide-eyed expressions filled with shock and fear. Nancy's vision blurred with tears, her heart pounding so hard it drowned out every other sound. The years of love, trust, and loyalty evaporated in an instant, leaving nothing but a crushing void. Her hands trembled, the reality of their betrayal fueling emotions she could no longer contain. A sudden, sharp motion shattered the stillness. George and Andrew were gone, their lives ending in an instant that could never be undone. The room was dead silent, the air feeling heavier by the second. Nancy just stood there, frozen, staring at what she'd done. Her chest tightened, and she struggled to catch her breath. It hit her all at once. There was no taking this back. Her whole world had shattered in an instant. Minutes passed before Nancy finally moved, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone. She didn't know who else to call. She just pressed a name. Susan. When Susan answered, Nancy's voice was barely a whisper. "I did it," she choked out. "I killed them." Susan arrived within minutes, her face pale as she stepped into the room and took in the horrific scene before her. She froze, unable to process the sight of her husband lying lifeless on the floor, George beside him. Her gaze shifted to Nancy, who stood motionless, her eyes vacant and red with tears. "What did you do, Nancy?" Susan's voice was barely a whisper, but the panic in it was unmistakable. "I didn't mean to," Nancy said, shaking her head, her voice broken. I couldn't stop myself." Susan took a step closer but kept her distance, fumbling with her phone. "I have to call the police," she said, her voice trembling. Nancy nodded numbly, staring at the bloodied floor. "I know." Law enforcement arrived at the scene within minutes, finding Nancy Schmidt inside the residence, visibly distressed but compliant. She was taken into custody without incident. First responders pronounced George Schmidt and Andrew Crowford dead at the scene. Investigators secured the area and collected physical evidence, including Nancy's fingerprints on the weapon and surveillance footage from nearby homes. Nancy was transported to the police station for questioning, where she provided a brief statement before requesting legal counsel. Authorities later confirmed that she had followed George to the residence and acted in a moment of emotional distress. Susan Crowford, who arrived shortly after the incident, was questioned as a witness and later released. Both families declined to comment publicly, but neighbors described the situation as shocking and out of character for Nancy. Nancy Schmidt was formally charged with 2 counts, and the case moved to trial, drawing significant media attention and speculation about the hidden tensions that led to the crime. She was sentenced to 40 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. In court, she showed little emotion as the verdict was read, her once perfect life reduced to a tragic cautionary tale.